Maryland's Real ID Act abuse, a barrier to black employment. Maryland's Real ID Act abuse, a barrier to black employment. Thank you for tuning in to Laurel with the Black Political Buzz Network. The Real ID Act, in case you have not heard of it, it is a real law. The Real ID Act was a law that was enacted, passed by Congress in the year 2005. It was signed into law by then President George W. Bush. So the Real ID Act is a real federal law. And it was supposed to be passed or enacted to give states, to give state governments a guideline of rules and regulations, standards to follow when authenticating, documents to prove one's identity, such as birth certificates, social security cards, passports, military IDs, etc. So when someone comes to a state and they try to obtain a driver's license or a state ID card or some type of identifying document as such, so that they can drive or live or work in that state, the Real ID Act passed by Congress in 2005 and signed into law by then President George W. Bush. The Real ID Act is supposed to give those states a guideline of what they can and cannot do when authenticating documents used to prove one's identity or legal citizenship in this nation, so that that individual will be approved or allowed the privilege of obtaining a driver's license for that state or that region, or a state ID card from that state or that region. Because having a driver's license is not a right, it's a privilege. Having an ID card is a right, because you need to have identifying, something to identify who you are so you can work. Now, if your job requires a driver's license, then that's still within itself a privilege, because you can get a job without a driver's license, but you cannot get a job without an ID card to identify and prove who you are as a citizen in this nation or as a human being on this earth. In the state of Maryland, the great, beautiful state of Maryland, because Maryland is a beautiful state. Many people only know Maryland by Baltimore, and they misjudge Maryland by Baltimore. But Baltimore has come up, y'all. There are many areas of Baltimore now that are not the way it was when The Wire was filmed. Many of you all were engaged in watching the Wire series that was on TV about 10 years ago. The series that was written and produced by David Simon. David Simon, who was a former Baltimore police officer, and he became a screenwriter, and he wrote the series The Wire, the award-winning series The Wire, which used many Baltimore, citizens and natives as actors. The majority of The Wire's cast members were actually from Baltimore, D.C., Virginia. The DMV, the Triangle, the DMV, the tri-state area. So many people think that Maryland only consists of Baltimore, but that's so wrong. Maryland is a huge state, and it's extremely beautiful. Beautiful. Come here and see for yourself. It is beautiful. I'm visiting Maryland. It's beautiful. Beautiful. Anyway, I learned since visiting Maryland how the Maryland Motor Vehicle Department, the MBA, is using or abusing, not using, but abusing the Real ID Act to keep African Americans and black citizens and some Latinos. That's right, some Latinos are also being, discriminated against by the Maryland Motor Vehicle, Department, the MVA. Many African Americans, many black people, many Latinos are being discriminated against from being able to obtain a driver's license or a ID card, which is a barrier to employment. People will come into the MBA with their identifying documents they have used all their life in other states, even to obtain federal jobs. But when they come to Maryland and go to the MBA, they say, oh, your birth certificate is not valid. Now, you would have used this birth certificate all your life in many states, even to get a federal job and to get federal documents. But the state of Maryland says, oh, we can't use that. And the people, the individuals whom are being given this incorrect, racist information by MBA employees who were incorrectly trained on the Real ID Act. You see, I'm a trained paralegal. I can read. I can read and research federal law. Federal law always supersedes state law. State law is supposed to follow the guidelines of federal law. State law is supposed to, when state legislators and governors pass laws for their state or for their region, their laws for that state or that region are supposed to be in line and congruent with federal laws, not supersede federal laws. Even when the federal government gives states the approval to create their own laws, those laws still must be in line with the U.S. Constitution and federal cases, federal law. That's why we have a U.S. Supreme Court which supersedes states' Supreme Courts. States have Supreme Courts, and then you have the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to rule based upon the U.S. Constitution. So a state like Maryland cannot just come up with its own laws when it comes to how it authenticates documents used to give someone a driver's license or a state ID card. Because if you are nitpicking only against African American or black citizens or Latino citizens and saying that their documents are not enough, and when they've used those documents in other states to obtain a driver's license or a state ID card, or they've used those documents to obtain a federal job or even join the military, and then they come to Maryland and Maryland says, oh no, that's missing something. That T wasn't crossed, that I wasn't dotted. We just want to make sure we're following federal law. You're not following federal law. You are discriminating because you're not doing that to Caucasian citizens. That's a problem. Can you say class action suit against the state of Maryland for practicing discrimination in their MBA department, which is a barrier to employment? Because if you can't get a state ID or driver's license, then how are you going to work? Then you want to say that they're being lazy. Then you want to say, oh, those black people are being lazy. Those Latino people are being lazy. Now, if they're legal black people, legal U.S. citizens, legal Latino citizens, and they come to the state of Maryland to obtain a driver's license or a state ID. And I'm not talking about someone coming to Maryland to get a driver's license and they have, a lot of points on their license from another state, or they have unpaid traffic offenses, unpaid traffic tickets. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about identifying documents to authenticate that person's identity. And it's on the list of documents that the MBA has given that individual. And then you still nitpick and say, no, can't give it to you. And then that applicant for that ID card or that driver's license for the state of Maryland walks away without their license or their ID card, and they can't start work. That's a problem. That's a problem. And which part of the government, which part of the United States government enforces the Real ID Act? The Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security. So there's a glitch here. Either the Department of Homeland Security has given the state of Maryland permission to abuse and misuse the Real ID Act for its intended purpose, or the state of Maryland, MBA, is abusing and misusing the Real ID Act on its own. Can you say class action suit? Can you say there needs to be a federal investigation against the state of Maryland's MBA, their motor vehicle division? Stay tuned. And if you have had this problem, if you are Black or Latino and you have been a victim of abuse or misuse by the Maryland's MBA because of identifying documents that have been used in other states or even by the federal government to grant you previous federal employment, military enlistment, or previous licenses or IDs in other states, and then you come to Maryland and you're Black or Latino and you're a legal citizen and you can't get an ID card or a license, hey, it needs to be an investigation. Maryland Real ID Act abuse, barrier to employment. Thank you for tuning in to Laurel with the Black Political Buzz Network. Goodbye.